There is a cold that settles into the bones of the Appalachian Mountains differently than anywhere else in America. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps down from the ridgelines in early October, quiet and patient, curling into the hollows and along the creek banks, pressing itself against the walls of hand-built cabins that leaned into hillsides as if bracing for what was coming. And what was coming, every single year, was a winter that didn't apologize for itself, didn't give warnings beyond the color of the sky and the thickness of a woolly bear caterpillar's coat. For the families who lived deep in those mountains, survival wasn't a skill they practiced on weekends or read about in books. It was the entire shape of their lives, from the first killing frost to the first tentative thaw of March. This is not a story about hardship for its own sake. It's about something quieter and more important than that. A complete system of living that stretched across generations, passed from one set of hands to another, refined by necessity and sharpened by the particular geography of a place where help was never close, and the mountains held their silence like a secret. What those families knew, and what we have largely allowed to slip away, was not primitive. It was sophisticated in ways that our modern minds have difficulty fully appreciating, because we have grown so accustomed to insulation from the consequences of not knowing. The Appalachian mountain chain runs roughly 1,500 miles from Alabama north into Canada, and the communities that settled its interior ridges and coves during the 18th and 19th centuries were, for generations, among the most geographically isolated populations in the continental United States. Roads that existed at all were often little more than packed dirt tracks that became impassable rivers of mud in wet weather and treacherous sheets of ice in winter. A family living in a remote hollow might be separated from the nearest town by 8 or 10 miles of mountain terrain. A journey that on foot or by mule in winter conditions could take the better part of a day. This was not inconvenience. This was a defining feature of existence, and it meant that everything needed for survival had to be produced, preserved, repaired, or improvised within the boundaries of what a single family or small community could manage on their own. The first thing those families understood about winter that we have forgotten entirely is that preparation for it was not a seasonal event. It was a year-round orientation. The moment the previous winter ended, work toward the next one began. This shaped everything: the timing of planting, the selection of crops, the rhythm of hunting, the construction of food storage, the cutting and splitting of firewood. A family that waited until September to seriously think about winter was already in trouble. Those who survived and survived well were those who had been quietly, steadily working toward February since February of the year before. Firewood was one of the great preoccupations of mountain life, and the knowledge surrounding it was more nuanced than it might appear. Different tree species burned differently, and experienced woodcutters knew these distinctions the way a modern cook knows the difference between cooking oils. Oak burned long and hot, making it ideal for overnight fires and heavy heating loads. Hickory burned almost as hot as coal and was prized for cooking because it held a steady, even heat. Black locust, one of the hardest and densest woods native to the Appalachians, could keep a fire going through the coldest night with relatively little wood. Pine and other softwoods caught quickly and were useful for starting fires, but burned fast and produced creosote that accumulated in chimneys. A serious fire hazard that mountain people managed with regular chimney cleaning using hickory branches or bundles of dried herbs. A family typically aimed to have 2 to 3 years of firewood, cut, split, and stacked under cover at any given time, because green wood, freshly cut, holds too much moisture to burn efficiently and had to be seasoned for at least a year before it was genuinely useful. This meant that the wood a family burned in the winter of 1887 had likely been cut in the fall of 1885 or early spring of 1886. The discipline this required, the sheer forward-thinking patience of it, is almost alien to our immediate, on-demand way of meeting needs. The root cellar was perhaps the single most important piece of infrastructure a mountain family could possess outside the cabin itself. And building a good one was both an art and a science. It had to be dug deep enough that the temperature inside remained stable regardless of what the air above ground was doing. Typically between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to slow the biological processes that cause food to spoil, but not so cold as to freeze the vegetables stored there. The ideal location was dug into a north-facing hillside, which provided natural insulation from summer sun, while allowing easy access through a low door built into the slope. Inside, the earth walls were often lined with flat stones to stabilize them, and the floor was left as bare dirt, which released just enough moisture to maintain the slight humidity that kept root vegetables from drying out and shriveling. On the wooden shelves that lined the walls, a well-stocked family might keep hundreds of pounds of potatoes, turnips, sweet potatoes, onions, cabbage heads, apples, dried beans, canned tomatoes, and green beans put up in glass jars sealed with paraffin wax, crocks of pickled vegetables submerged in brine, and rounds of hard cheese wrapped in cloth that had been rubbed with lard to prevent mold. The root cellar was, in the most literal sense, the difference between eating and not eating in February. And families tended it with the same attention they gave any living thing under their care. The art of preservation ran through every aspect of mountain food culture, and the techniques used were not single methods, but an entire toolkit applied based on what was being stored and how long it needed to last. Smoking was among the oldest and most reliable of these methods. The smokehouse was a small outbuilding constructed deliberately for this purpose, typically with tight-fitted log or board walls and a floor of bare earth where a slow, cool fire could be maintained for days at a time. Hams, sides of bacon, and sausage were hung from the rafters and smoked over chips of hickory or apple wood, both of which produced a dense, aromatic smoke that not only dried the surface of the meat, but deposited antimicrobial compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. A properly smoked Appalachian ham could hang in a cool, dry room for a year or more without refrigeration and remain safe and flavorful. The salt cure that preceded the smoking was equally important. Cuts of pork were packed in coarse salt for weeks, drawing moisture out of the tissue in a process that made the interior of the meat hostile to the organisms that caused spoilage. The combination of salt curing and smoking represented a level of food science, developed entirely through observation and accumulated experience, that modern food preservation research has only recently begun to fully document and explain. Lard was the fat that held mountain cooking together, and its production and storage was a fall ritual of considerable importance. When a hog was slaughtered, which was almost always done in the cold months after the first hard freeze, so that the meat would not spoil during butchering, the fat was trimmed from the carcass and rendered in large iron kettles over outdoor fires. The solid fat melted slowly into a clear liquid that was then strained and poured into clay crocks or tin containers to cool and solidify. Well-rendered lard stored in a cool, dark place could remain usable for up to a year. And it served purposes far beyond cooking. It was rubbed on leather to keep it supple, worked into wool before spinning to make the fibers easier to handle, applied to the skin as a barrier against the cold and wind, and used to grease the wooden runners of sleds. Families that raised several hogs and rendered their fat carefully entered winter with a resource that touched almost every aspect of daily life. And the loss of hog butchering knowledge in the generations after rural electrification and the arrival of modern refrigeration represents one of the more profound breaks in the chain of practical knowledge that once connected Appalachian families to self-sufficiency. The mountain people's relationship with wild food is often romanticized in ways that miss its real character. Hunting and gathering in the Appalachians was not recreation. It was a serious, skilled pursuit that extended the food supply in ways that could be the deciding factor between a family making it through winter with their health intact or arriving at spring depleted and vulnerable. Deer were hunted throughout the cold months when the meat would keep without spoiling, and the entire animal was used with a completeness that modern hunters rarely practice. The organs were eaten first, since they do not keep. The hindquarters and shoulders were smoked or salted. The bones were boiled for broth that could be fortified with dried vegetables from the root cellar to make a soup substantial enough to constitute a full meal. The hide was scraped and tanned, often using the animal's own brain, which contains just enough fat and enzymes to process a single hide. and made into moccasins, gloves, or patches for worn-out clothing. Sinew from along the back strap was saved for thread. Even the rendered fat from the kidneys was saved and used. What the mountains provided beyond game was a wild pantry that mountain people read with a knowledge born of long familiarity. Ramps, the pungent wild onion that grows in dense colonies along shaded creek banks, were among the first green things to emerge in spring. And they were gathered eagerly after months of a diet heavy in preserved foods and light in anything fresh. They were eaten raw, cooked with beans and fatback, or pickled in vinegar for later use. Pawpaws, the largest fruit native to North America, and one almost completely unknown to most Americans today, grew along stream banks and in sheltered coves and produced a custard yellow fruit in September that tasted of banana and mango and was eaten fresh or dried for preservation. Black walnuts, which grow wild throughout the Appalachians, were cracked with rocks or hammers, and the nut meats extracted with hand tools. A laborious process, but one that yielded a rich, dense, calorie-intensive food that stored well through winter. Wild greens, poke salad before it became too large and toxic, watercress from cold springs, wood sorrel with its clean lemony flavor, supplemented the diet throughout the warmer months, and were dried or preserved for winter when they could be found. Water management in a mountain hollow was not as simple as digging a well, and the solutions mountain families developed to ensure reliable access to clean water through all seasons reflected both ingenuity and deep familiarity with the local landscape. Springs, places where groundwater naturally emerges from the hillside, were the most valued water sources in Appalachian communities. Because spring water maintains a nearly constant temperature of around 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which means it flows freely even in winter while surface water freezes and remains cool enough in summer to keep perishables cold. Families that had a reliable spring on their land considered it among their most valuable assets, and spring boxes, simple wooden or stone structures built around the spring outlet to protect it from contamination and create a small reservoir, were maintained with care. Food could be kept in the spring box through summer, using the naturally cold water the same way a modern refrigerator uses compressor-cooled air. The making of soap was a domestic skill whose disappearance from ordinary American life is so complete that most people today have never seen it done and would not know where to begin. Mountain families made their own soap from two ingredients that were byproducts of other processes: wood ash and animal fat. The ash from the fireplace and cooking stove was collected throughout winter and saved in a wooden barrel or hollowed log with a hole in the bottom. When enough ash had accumulated in spring, water was poured through it, dissolving the potassium compounds in the ash to create lye water, a strongly alkaline liquid with a slippery feel and enough caustic strength to burn skin on contact. This lye water was combined with animal fat, the scraps and trimmings left after rendering lard, or the accumulated grease from cooking, in a large iron kettle and boiled together for hours, a process called saponification, in which the lye chemically converts the fat into soap. The resulting soft soap, yellowish and pungent, was used for everything from washing clothing and bodies to scrubbing the wooden surfaces of the cabin. Making a batch required accurate judgment of the lye concentration. Too weak and the soap wouldn't set. Too strong and it would remain caustic. And experienced soap makers tested the lye by floating an egg in it. The egg should float with a surface area about the size of a quarter, exposed above the waterline. This was empirical chemistry conducted entirely without instruments or formal education, refined through practice and passed through generations of women who held this knowledge as a matter of ordinary competence. Candles were the primary source of artificial light in mountain cabins before the widespread use of kerosene lamps in the latter half of the 19th century, and their production was another fall task, scheduled alongside butchering, preserving, and wood splitting. Tallow candles were made from rendered beef or mutton fat, which produces a harder, more stable candle than lard, melted and poured in thin layers around twisted cotton wicks, with each layer allowed to cool before the next was added, building up the candle body slowly. A well-made tallow candle burned for several hours, but it was smoky, and produced an unpleasant smell. A familiar feature of mountain cabin life that historical accounts from the period note frequently. Families that had access to beeswax made candles of far superior quality. Beeswax candles burned cleanly, slowly, and with a honey-sweet scent. But wax required maintaining hives, which was a skill in itself and not within every family's capacity. Resin from pine trees, collected where it had oozed naturally from wounds in the bark, could also be formed into simple torches that provided rough illumination for outdoor tasks. The careful rationing of whatever light source a family possessed through the long winter nights, working by firelight for sewing and mending and storytelling when candles were not strictly necessary, was simply part of the discipline of making resources last until they could be replenished. Medicinal plant knowledge in the Appalachians represented one of the most sophisticated bodies of practical pharmacology ever developed outside of formal scientific institutions. Isolated from doctors, who were expensive, distant, and sometimes not clearly more effective than traditional treatments, mountain families relied on a materia medica derived almost entirely from the wild plants around them, and passed through the community primarily by older women who served as healers. Boneset, whose bitter tea was used to treat fevers and the bone-deep aches of influenza, gets its name not from its use on broken bones, but from the older term break bone fever, for a severe flu-like illness. Mullein, with its tall flower stalks and soft, almost velvet-textured leaves, was brewed into a tea for respiratory ailments and the leaves used to poultice the chest. Ginseng, which grows slowly in the shaded coves of the Appalachians and was already being harvested for trade in the 18th century, was understood to have restorative properties long before Western medicine began investigating its compounds. Black cohosh, golden seal, bloodroot. The wild pharmacopoeia of the mountains was extensive, and the women who knew it understood not only which plants were useful, but which were dangerous, in what doses and preparations, and what combinations to avoid. This knowledge took years to acquire and could not easily be written down or transferred through books. It lived in practice, in apprenticeship, in the accumulated clinical observation of generations. And its loss with the coming of modern medicine is both understandable and genuinely regrettable, because much of it contained more practical wisdom than we yet fully recognize. Clothing repair and textile production were daily realities of mountain life, in a way that most modern Americans would find almost incomprehensible. Store-bought fabric was expensive and difficult to obtain, and the tradition of homespinning and weaving remained alive in many mountain communities well into the 20th century. Wool was sheared from sheep in spring, washed to remove the lanolin and dirt, combed or carded to align the fibers, and spun on a spinning wheel into yarn, a process that required significant skill and steady hands and produced a yarn whose thickness and evenness depended entirely on the spinner's experience. The yarn was then either knitted into stockings, gloves, and caps, or woven on a floor loom into cloth for heavier garments. Clothing that wore out was not discarded but repaired, relined, and eventually cut apart and used as quilt fabric, with even the smallest scraps saved for stuffing or used as rags. Quilts themselves, now considered primarily decorative, were working objects, heavy, dense insulation against mountain cold, often made with an inner layer of raw cotton batting or wool fleece between two layers of pieced fabric. And a family's collection of quilts was a meaningful measure of their preparation for winter. Every stitch in those quilts had been placed by hand, often during the long evenings of winter itself, in the light of tallow candles or firelight, by women and sometimes men whose fingers moved through patterns learned by watching rather than reading. The keeping of livestock through an Appalachian winter required a relationship between people and animals that had a quality of genuine mutual dependence. Cattle, hogs, sheep, and chickens were not abstract food sources, but daily responsibilities whose welfare directly shaped the family's survival prospects. Animals had to be fed through months when pasture provided nothing, requiring hay to have been cut and stored in sufficient quantities. During summer, a labor-intensive process done entirely with hand tools. Water sources had to be kept from freezing, which often meant breaking ice on a daily basis, or routing water from a spring that didn't freeze. Livestock were sometimes brought into the lower level of a two-story barn, where their body heat contributed to keeping the temperature above freezing, a form of passive heating that also warmed the hay storage above and was entirely calculated and deliberate. The condition of animals in late winter, how much body weight they had maintained, how their coats looked, how the laying hens were producing, was a direct reflection of how well the family had prepared and how the season had gone, and experienced mountain farmers read these signs with the practiced attention of people whose livelihood and their own health were directly at stake. Navigation of the mountain landscape without roads, signage, or maps was a survival skill of the first order, and Appalachian woodspeople developed methods of orientation and wayfinding that combined observation, memory, and the reading of natural signs. Moss grew most heavily on the north-facing sides of trees and rocks, a rough compass in itself, though one to be read alongside other indicators. Creek drainages provided directional orientation, since water flows consistently downhill toward larger waterways and eventually to known valleys. The shape of ridgelines, the species composition of different forest types, the sound and behavior of wildlife. All of these were read as information by people who moved through the landscape constantly and had learned to attend to it in a way that those who rarely leave paved roads cannot easily imagine. Hunters who pursued game into unfamiliar terrain far from home navigated by these signs, by the position of the sun, and by the discipline of paying continuous attention to where they had come from. A mental mapping skill, developed through practice and essential in a landscape where becoming lost in winter conditions was a potentially fatal situation. What has been lost ultimately is not primarily the specific techniques, though those are worth knowing, worth preserving, worth practicing. What has been lost is the orientation toward the world that produced them. The understanding that the cold and the dark and the distance are real, that the earth's rhythms are not negotiable, that preparation is not optional, and that human beings are capable of meeting genuine difficulty with intelligence, creativity, and remarkable ingenuity when they have no choice but to do so. The families of the Appalachian Mountains did not consider themselves heroic. They considered themselves ordinary. The smokehouse and the root cellar and the spinning wheel and the soap kettle were not remarkable to them. They were simply what you did, what you knew, what you passed to your children along with the family name and whatever small piece of land you might leave behind. Modern life has made us more comfortable in ways that are genuinely good and worth appreciating. Fewer people die of infection. Fewer go hungry because a crop failed. Fewer lose families to the cold. These are not small things, but comfort and security, when they become complete and unexamined, can quietly hollow out capacities that took generations to build. The patience to work toward a future winter, the skill to produce what you need with your own hands, the knowledge of what the land around you can provide, the confidence that comes from genuine competence rather than from access to systems you neither understand nor control. Somewhere in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, in the oldest and most unchanged hollows of the Appalachian chain, there are still people who know some of this. Old men who can look at a stand of timber and tell you, without thinking about it very hard, which trees to cut first for next winter's firewood and which to leave for the year after. Old women who still put up dozens of quart jars of green beans and tomatoes each summer, who keep a root cellar under the back porch, not as a nostalgic affectation, but as a practical matter, because they grew up watching their grandparents rely on it, and they never entirely stopped. These are not museum pieces. They are the last living connections to a system of knowledge so complete and so carefully adapted to a specific place, and its particular demands that it sustained human life for generations, under conditions that would challenge most modern people profoundly. The cabins are mostly gone now, replaced by trailers and small houses with electric heat and gas stoves. The smokehouses have fallen or been converted to storage. The root cellars have filled with water or been used as foundations. The spinning wheels are in antique shops. The soap kettles are yard ornaments. And the knowledge that once moved through all of these objects, the knowledge that knew why they existed and how to use them and when and with what care, that knowledge is thinning with each passing year, held by fewer hands, at risk of slipping out of human memory entirely, as quietly and finally as smoke rising off a winter ridgeline and disappearing into the sky. Some things, once lost, do not come back easily. The Appalachian people knew this about seeds, about soil, about the old-growth trees they watched disappear from the ridges around them. They may have known it about knowledge too, though they would not have put it in those terms. They would have said, more simply, you can't plant what you don't have. You can't teach what you don't know. And winter, when it comes, does not wait for you to be ready.